down to just Senator Lee and myself here, and I'm going to have to leave at about 5 to 5. And so I'm going to let him maybe do 5 minutes or so. I'll have 2 more questions, and we could go from there.
Thank you. Mr. Gaynor, let's go back to you, if that's all right. How do you believe consumer trust or distrust of news publishers might impact their success? I ask because the Edelman Trust Barometer, as displayed in the chart behind me, shows a growing mistrust of the media across the globe. Edelman reported this year that 46% of people around the world view government and media as divisive forces in society, and 74% of Americans worry about fake news. How do you think political bias, or including anti-conservative censorship, might have contributed to that mistrust?
I think it helps contribute to it a lot, both on the the big tech side and on the media side. And again, that's when you're talking about large media outlets, corporate media, it's not a slam on local news. But when ordinary Americans think about media, they're generally not thinking about their local news outlet, their weekly newspaper, their radio station. They're thinking about larger media. They're thinking about the media they see on TV. And then they're also thinking about the problems of big tech. I mean, if this committee or others want to go to war with big tech, I think conservatives would be very happy about that. But the question is, does this bill work to do that? And when you look at the years of gradual decline of people's interest in media, and then you also look at the rising tide of people distrusting media, the two track very similarly.
And that makes some intuitive sense, and there seems to be anecdotal support for that. At least intuitively, it makes sense to me. Now, the Congressional Research Service has noted that 70% of daily newspapers are owned by private equity firms, hedge funds, or other investment groups. Nothing wrong with those business models, but those are the data that I've got. Now, do you think these owners are necessarily going to be more concerned about investing in journalists and quality journalism than they are about getting a return on investment? And regardless, would the JCPA make a difference in that regard? Is the JCPA going to change the incentives in place for the owners of these businesses one way or another?
Well, it certainly doesn't seem like it. I mean, you look at just the Washington Post, for example. The Post its identity is as a national newspaper. When it owned a chain of weeklies that were very popular in suburbia, it shut them down. When Tribune owned the Baltimore Sun, they had a chain of weeklies that they gutted to the point where they're largely non-existent now. That's been an ongoing problem. Not necessarily the local ownership. Local ownership, which I think is reflected on this panel, local ownership tends to care about the local community. And but when it's national ownership, and you were saying 70%. Then they're not necessarily loyal to their readers or their viewers.
Mr. Oxley, well, I'm never going to support legislation that I believe attempts to improve competition by forming a cartel, as this one does. If the purpose of something like the JCPA is to protect small and independent local publishers, then why not at least limit the bill's scope? Why not limit its application to small and independent local publishers?
Well, I don't know the ins and outs of that as well as an awful lot of people in this room, and I haven't been able to look at the ins and outs of the bill and how it works.
Are you saying that you would support it if it were so limited?
Well, I would certainly support anything that would help local news. I feel at this point that we're in a really, really tough spot with local news. And that's, to me, what we're really talking about here. We're not talking about the national news players. Local news players are still some of the most trusted in America. You know, study after study shows that your local news people are trusted, and that there's actually a very favorable view of them. You know, the national is a different story, but locally, and we need something to help out, truly help out the local news providers.
So then, but if that's the case, if we are going to make it, as most of this discussion today has been, if we are going to make it about the local folks, then why not limit it to them? Dr. Francis, I assume you'd agree with the suggestion that if you buy into the notion that creating a cartel or a type of cartel permission slip is acceptable for one universe, you could reduce the harm inflicted by that universe where cartels are authorized by reducing the scope. And in this case, since most of the discussion has focused around small, independent, local publishers, couldn't that have that effect?
I think that's exactly right, Senator. So as you've heard, I have pretty strong feelings about cartels, but I don't object in principle anything like so much to the idea of supporting local struggling news publishers. So at a minimum, restricting the scope of what you're describing, restricting in the way you describe the scope of the exemption so that it's truly targeted at small struggling publishers. That means we can avoid conferring the ability to, add a cartel overcharge to large, very profitable media companies. That would really help. I am pretty uncomfortable at this moment in our sort of political life about taking a big bite out of antitrust when we should be reinforcing it. So I would love to be talking about other ways to support local news, but any support mechanism should be targeted to those who really need it, not to the most prominent publishers.
And is there a risk but that by focusing on this particular issue, it might draw attention away from other things that also need to be addressed, including the problem we've got with Google and Facebook?
I think digital monopoly and monopoly in general is a problem that at the minute vastly overmatches the ability of our antitrust agencies. I would love to see more funding and more resources. I think that's the most urgent need we have as a competition policy community in this country. Even more urgent than antitrust reform is money and personnel for the agencies. And that's where I would love the focus of the conversation to be. That's what I think is top of the wish list.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Lee, and thank you for, I'm sure you have other questions.